The rain hammered against the windshield of Michael Anderson's aging sedan as he navigated the darkened streets of downtown Seattle at midnight. His shift at the emergency dispatch center had run late again, another crisis keeping him from the promise he'd made to himself to be home before Emma fell asleep. At 34, Michael carried the weight of single parenthood like a carefully balanced load, every decision measured against his 7-year-old daughter's needs. The radio crackled with late-night calls, but his mind was already at home, wondering if Emma had remembered to brush her teeth, if she'd had another nightmare about the accident that took her mother 3 years ago. His phone buzzed against the dashboard, and for a moment his heart clenched with the familiar fear that something had happened to Emma. But the caller ID showed his neighbor Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher who watched Emma during his late shifts. Her voice was calm when he answered, reassuring him that Emma was sleeping soundly, curled up with the stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since the funeral. As he turned onto Pine Street, heading toward the modest apartment he and Emma called home, Michael's headlights caught a figure stumbling along the sidewalk. The young woman wore a designer dress that looked expensive even in the dim streetlight, but her steps were unsteady, and she seemed to be searching for something in her purse with growing frustration. Michael had seen enough accidents in his years as a dispatcher to recognize someone who shouldn't be walking alone at this hour, especially not in her condition. He pulled over, rolling down his passenger window as the rain continued to pour. The woman looked up, her makeup smeared, her hair damp from the rain, and for a moment their eyes met through the storm. She couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of privilege and opportunity, but right now she looked lost and vulnerable in a way that reminded Michael of Emma when she woke from her nightmares. He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening, the same tone he used when coaxing frightened callers to stay on the line during emergencies. She seemed to be weighing her options, glancing back at the upscale bar she'd apparently left, then at his ordinary car with its child safety seat visible in the back. Something in his expression must have convinced her of his good intentions, because she accepted his offer of a ride, sliding into the passenger seat with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. The address she gave him was in the exclusive Magnolia neighborhood, where houses sat behind gates and manicured lawns, a world away from the cramped apartment complex, where Michael struggled to make ends meet. During the drive, she dozed fitfully, occasionally mumbling apologies or fragments of conversations that didn't quite make sense. Michael adjusted the heat, turned down the radio, and drove carefully through the storm, thinking about how he would feel if Emma were ever in this situation years from now. When they reached her address, a sprawling modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly in the darkness, the woman stirred and tried to gather herself. She fumbled for her purse, attempting to pay him, but Michael waved away the money. He helped her to the front door, making sure she had her keys, waiting until she was safely inside before driving away into the night. He thought that would be the end of it, just another small kindness in a world that often felt short on compassion. The next morning arrived with Emma's usual chaos, her alarm clock somehow failing to wake her, despite being set to a volume that could rouse the entire building. Michael moved through their established routine with the efficiency born of necessity, helping her choose clothes that matched while making breakfast, checking her homework while braiding her hair into the pigtails she preferred. Their small apartment bore the signs of a man doing his best to create a home for his daughter, children's artwork covering the refrigerator, books stacked on every available surface, and the lingering scent of the vanilla candles Emma loved because they reminded her of birthday cake. The morning light streaming through their single window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment, Michael allowed himself to appreciate the simple beauty of his daughter's laughter as she told him about the dream she'd had, something involving flying horses and ice cream mountains. The knock at the door came just as Michael was helping Emma into her backpack, preparing for the walk to school that had become one of their favorite parts of the day. Emma loved pointing out the flowers in Mrs. Patterson's garden, the cat that always sat in the bookstore window, the way the morning light painted the buildings in shades of gold and amber. Michael opened the door, expecting to see Mrs. Chen, or perhaps the building manager, with another notice about rising rent, but instead found himself face to face with a man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his presence commanding even in the narrow hallway of the apartment building. The man's eyes were sharp, intelligent, and vaguely familiar in a way that made Michael's chest tighten with unspoken concern. Behind the stranger stood two other men, also well-dressed, also watchful, and Michael's dispatcher instincts immediately cataloged the situation as potentially dangerous. Emma peered around her father's legs with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her backpack still slung over her small shoulders, ready for another day of adventures and learning. The man's expression softened when he saw her, and something in his posture shifted from intimidation to something more human, more vulnerable. His voice, when he spoke, was cultured, educated, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, but also touched with an emotion that Michael couldn't quite identify. The man introduced himself with a name that meant nothing to Michael, but the weight with which he said it suggested it should carry significance. He explained that he was looking for the man who had helped his daughter the night before, the stranger who had driven her home safely when she was too intoxicated to care for herself. Michael's mind raced back to the young woman in the rain, trying to reconcile her with this powerful man's daughter, wondering what consequences his simple act of kindness might have unleashed. The man's eyes never left Michael's face as he spoke, as if searching for something specific, some quality or character trait that would explain why a stranger had shown such care for someone he didn't know. Emma tugged at Michael's hand, reminding him that they needed to leave for school, and the interaction took on a surreal quality, as Michael tried to balance his daughter's immediate needs with the growing tension of the moment. The stranger seemed to understand the delicate balance of the situation, stepping back slightly to give them space while making it clear that the conversation was far from over. He handed Michael a business card with the understated elegance that spoke of real power, not the flashy display of those who merely aspired to it. The card was heavy, expensive, with embossed lettering that caught the light, and when Michael read the name and title, he felt his stomach drop. The man standing in his doorway wasn't just any father looking to thank a good Samaritan. He was someone whose name appeared regularly in the business section of the newspaper, whose decisions affected thousands of employees, whose influence reached into every corner of the city's economic and political landscape. As Emma's impatience grew and the school bell drew closer, Michael found himself agreeing to meet later that day, accepting an invitation that felt less like a request and more like a summons. The man's parting words carried a weight that followed Michael throughout the morning, a promise, or perhaps a warning, that their paths would cross again very soon. The apartment that afternoon felt smaller somehow, as if the presence of power had compressed its modest dimensions. Michael sat at the kitchen table where he and Emma shared their meals, did homework, and planned their modest adventures, staring at the business card that represented a world so far from his own it might as well have been another planet. The meeting was set for 4 o'clock at an address downtown that Michael recognized as one of the most prestigious office buildings in the city. As the time approached, he found himself changing clothes twice, unsure what one wore to meet with someone whose casual decisions could reshape entire industries. His best shirt was clean, but showed the wear of too many washings, his shoes polished but unable to hide their age, and he realized with a mixture of pride and insecurity that he looked exactly like what he was, a working father doing his best to provide for his child. The elevator ride to the top floor seemed to last forever, the city shrinking below him as he rose toward a meeting that might change everything he thought he knew about his place in the world. The receptionist, a woman whose clothes probably cost more than Michael made in a month, directed him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline. The space was designed to intimidate, all polished surfaces and expensive art, the kind of room where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen. When the door opened and the man from that morning entered, he was followed not just by his associates, but by the young woman Michael had driven home the night before. She looked completely different in the harsh light of day, her professional attire and perfect makeup transforming her into someone who belonged in this rarefied atmosphere, but her eyes held a vulnerability that reminded him of the frightened person he'd encountered in the rain. She thanked him simply, directly, her voice carrying genuine gratitude that seemed to surprise her father, as if such displays of emotion were rare in their family's interactions. The man, who Michael now knew to be one of the city's most influential real estate developers, explained that his investigation into the previous night's events had revealed not just Michael's act of kindness, but details about his life that should have been private. He knew about Emma, about Michael's job, about the struggles they faced each month to make rent and buy groceries, about the medical bills from his wife's final illness that still arrived with depressing regularity. The invasion of privacy should have angered Michael, but instead he felt a cold recognition that this was how power worked, reaching into every corner of ordinary people's lives whether they wanted it there or not. The developer's proposition was presented with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, but the details took Michael's breath away. A job with the city's emergency management department, a position that would triple his current salary while allowing him to use his skills in ways that could genuinely help people during their worst moments. A house in a neighborhood with excellent schools, where Emma could have her own room and a backyard to play in, where the constant worry about rent and utilities could become a memory instead of a daily stress. The offer was everything Michael had dreamed of being able to provide for his daughter, everything that seemed impossibly out of reach for someone with his background and resources, and it was being handed to him because he had done what any decent person should do when they encountered someone in need. The catch, when it came, was delivered with the same casual tone as the offer, as if it were a minor detail rather than a fundamental shift in the balance of power between them. The developer wanted Michael's word that he would be available when needed, that he would understand the obligations that came with such generosity, that he would remember who had lifted him and his daughter from their struggles into a better life. The phrasing was careful, diplomatic, but the message was clear. This wasn't charity, it was an investment, and investments came with expectations of return. Michael looked at the young woman who had started this chain of events, searching her face for some clue about what kind of man her father really was, what kind of life she lived in his shadow. Her expression was unreadable, schooled into the careful neutrality that probably served her well in a family where emotions were leverage and kindness was currency. She seemed to be watching the interaction with the detached interest of someone who had seen this performance before, who knew how it ended but felt powerless to change the script. The silence stretched between them as Michael weighed his options, thinking about Emma's face when she talked about her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, about the cramped apartment where she did her homework at the kitchen table while he worked on his laptop, about the nights when he lay awake calculating whether they could afford new shoes for her growing feet. The decision should have been easy, his daughter's future against his own sense of independence, but something in the developer's confidence made him hesitate. This man was used to buying people, to solving problems with money and influence, and Michael wondered what happened to those who disappointed him, who failed to live up to their end of bargains they'd never truly understood. The young woman shifted in her seat, and for a moment her mask slipped, revealing something that might have been sympathy or warning, a flicker of emotion that suggested she understood the weight of the choice her father was forcing upon him. The city spread out below them through the massive windows, millions of people living their lives without knowing that in this room, in this moment, the course of two lives was being determined by the whims of power and the consequences of a single act of human decency. Michael thought about his wife, about the promises he'd made to her before she died, about the kind of man he wanted Emma to see when she looked at her father. The answer, when it came, surprised even him, emerging from a place of quiet strength he didn't know he possessed, a recognition that some prices were too high to pay, no matter how desperately you needed what was being offered in return. His refusal was polite but firm, delivered with the same calm tone he used when talking frightened callers through emergency situations. And he watched as the developer's confident expression shifted to something harder, more calculating. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, as if she'd never seen anyone turn down her father's offers before, and Michael wondered if his decision had just made him an enemy or earned him a grudging respect. The meeting ended with handshakes and business cards, with promises to stay in touch that felt more like threats than genuine offers of friendship, and Michael left the gleaming office building with the strange sensation that he had just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. The phone call came 3 days later, just as Michael was helping Emma with the math worksheet that seemed designed to frustrate second graders and their parents in equal measure. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but professional, someone from the emergency management department calling to inform him that his application for a supervisory position had been accepted, that his background check had been expedited, and that he could start Monday if he was interested. Michael had never applied for any such position, had never even known such opportunities existed, and as he listened to the details, salary, benefits, responsibilities that seemed tailored specifically to his skills and experience, he began to understand that his refusal had not ended the developer's interest in him. The job was real, legitimate, everything the caller described could be verified through official channels, but the timing and the specifics made it clear that powerful hands had guided this opportunity his way. Emma looked up from her math problems, sensing the change in her father's tone, and Michael found himself once again facing a choice between pride and pragmatism, between independence and his daughter's future. This time the offer came with no strings attached, no explicit obligations, just an opportunity to serve his community, while providing for his family in ways he'd never imagined possible. The house came 2 weeks after he started the new job, a modest but comfortable place in a neighborhood where Emma could walk to school safely, where she had her own room and a small garden where they could plant vegetables together. The seller, Michael learned, had received an offer too good to refuse from an anonymous buyer who immediately made the property available for rent at a price that seemed almost suspiciously affordable. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too convenient to be mere luck. But Michael found himself grateful despite his suspicions, watching Emma discover the joy of having space to spread out her art projects, seeing her make friends with the neighbor children, who welcomed her with the easy acceptance of childhood. The work itself proved to be everything he'd hoped for, utilizing his skills as a dispatcher while expanding his responsibilities in ways that challenged and fulfilled him. He coordinated emergency responses during a late-season snowstorm that caught the city unprepared, helping to ensure that resources reached the most vulnerable residents before conditions became life-threatening. He developed new protocols for communicating with non-English-speaking callers, drawing on his own experiences of feeling lost and overwhelmed to create systems that served everyone more effectively. His colleagues respected his insights and experience, treating him as an equal rather than an outsider who'd somehow lucked into a position beyond his qualifications. The young woman appeared in his life again 6 months later, not as her father's daughter, but as someone seeking help with a project that mattered to her personally. She was working with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to families dealing with addiction, and she needed someone with emergency response experience to help develop their crisis intervention protocols. Her approach was professional, careful, as if she were testing whether he could separate his feelings about her father from his willingness to help with meaningful work. They met at a coffee shop near his office, the same one where he used to nurse a single cup for hours when money was tight, and she seemed genuinely interested in his insights, taking notes as he shared observations about what worked and what didn't when people called for help during their darkest moments. She mentioned her father only once, noting that he didn't know about her volunteer work, that this was something she did independently, a way of trying to balance the scales of a life that had been shaped by privilege and power. Michael found himself liking her, recognizing in her the same sense of responsibility he felt toward Emma, the desire to make choices based on what was right rather than what was easy. The project became a collaboration that lasted months, growing into something more meaningful than either of them had anticipated. They developed training programs for volunteers, created resource guides for families in crisis, established partnerships with other organizations that could provide comprehensive support. Working together revealed qualities in both of them that might have remained hidden in other circumstances: his ability to see complex systems clearly, her talent for bringing together diverse groups of people around common goals. Emma, now 8 and growing more perceptive by the day, noticed when her father started talking about work with enthusiasm rather than resignation, when he came home energized rather than drained. She met the young woman during a weekend event at the community center, where volunteers were teaching children about emergency preparedness through games and activities. Emma took to her immediately, with the instinctive trust children have for adults who see them as individuals rather than obstacles, and Michael watched their interaction with a mixture of warmth and wariness, wondering what complications might arise from letting their worlds intersect. The developer himself remained a distant presence, occasionally mentioned in newspaper articles about major real estate transactions or city planning decisions, but never directly intruding on the life Michael had built with his help. Sometimes Michael wondered if the man was simply waiting, biding his time until the debt he felt owed could be collected, or if his interference had been motivated by genuine respect for the character Michael had shown that rainy night. The question troubled him less as time passed and no demands materialized, as the job and house and opportunities began to feel like they belonged to him through his own efforts, rather than another man's whims. The crisis that brought everything into focus came during a citywide emergency, when an earthquake damaged several major buildings and knocked out power to thousands of homes. Michael's role placed him at the center of the coordinated response, working 18-hour days to ensure that emergency services reached those who needed them most urgently. The developer's company owned several of the affected buildings, and there were moments when Michael had to make decisions about resource allocation that could directly impact the man's financial interests. He treated those properties exactly as he treated all others, prioritizing response based on need rather than ownership, and felt a quiet satisfaction when no phone calls came pressuring him to reconsider his choices. The young woman worked alongside other volunteers in the emergency shelters, coordinating services for displaced families, and Michael saw her interacting with people from every economic background with the same respect and attention. She had learned something about genuine service that her upbringing might not have taught her, developed empathy that went beyond the checkbook charity often practiced by those born to wealth. When they worked together during the crisis, there was no sense of class difference. Just two people committed to helping their community recover from disaster. Their relationship deepened over the months that followed, built through shared work, honest conversation, and the gradual lowering of defenses that had protected them both from past disappointments. She began joining them for some of their weekend activities, discovering the simple pleasures of playground visits and library trips, learning to see the city through Emma's eyes as a place of endless wonder and possibility. Michael watched her interact with his daughter with growing appreciation for her authenticity, the way she answered Emma's questions seriously, the genuine interest she showed in a child's perspective on complex issues. The conversation that changed everything happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Emma was at a sleepover with her new best friend, leaving Michael and the young woman alone in a house that felt both familiar and charged with possibility. They had been working on plans for expanding the nonprofit's services, but the discussion gradually moved toward more personal territory, toward questions about what they wanted their futures to look like, about whether those visions might include each other. She was the first to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing between them, speaking with the careful honesty that had become characteristic of their relationship, explaining that she cared about him and Emma more than she had expected to, more than felt safe given the complicated circumstances of how they had met. Michael's response was equally careful, equally honest, acknowledging his own growing feelings while raising the questions that had to be addressed, about her father's reaction, about the potential impact on Emma, about whether their different backgrounds could really be bridged by mutual affection and shared values. The kiss that followed felt like both an answer and a beginning, gentle and tentative, but carrying the weight of months of growing trust and understanding. They held each other afterward in the quiet of the living room where Emma's artwork covered the walls, and family photos marked the milestones of a life rebuilt from loss, and Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death, the possibility of love that could expand rather than replace, that could honor the past while embracing the future. The conversation with Emma came the next week, approached with the same careful honesty that marked all their important discussions, explaining that sometimes adults become more than friends when they care about each other very much, asking how she would feel if that happened with someone they both already cared about. Emma's response was characteristically direct, asking if it meant the lady would come to more family dinners and help with art projects, practical considerations that mattered more to an 8-year-old than abstract concepts about adult relationships. Her approval was given with the casual confidence of a child who trusted her father's judgment, coupled with specific requests about maintaining their weekend traditions and ensuring that any changes would add to rather than subtract from their family's happiness. The meeting with her father was inevitable, approached with considerable anxiety by both Michael and the young woman, but necessary if their relationship was to move forward honestly. The developer received them in his office, the same room where he had first made his offer, but the dynamic had shifted significantly. Michael came not as a supplicant or someone seeking favor, but as an equal protecting something precious, making it clear that his feelings for the man's daughter were genuine, and that his intentions were honorable. The conversation was civil but tense, with the older man probing Michael's motivations and long-term plans, clearly struggling with the reality that his daughter had chosen someone outside their social circle, someone who couldn't be controlled through the usual mechanisms of wealth and influence. The young woman's defense of their relationship was fierce and articulate, making it clear that she was choosing Michael not as an act of rebellion, but as a mature decision based on compatibility and shared values. She spoke about the life they were building together, about the way Michael had shown her what authentic living looked like, about Emma's role in teaching her about unconditional love. Her father listened with the careful attention he probably gave to important business presentations, and Michael could see him calculating, weighing his daughter's happiness against his own preferences and concerns. The resolution, when it came, was not the dramatic confrontation Michael had feared, but a grudging acceptance that reflected the developer's recognition that his daughter was an adult, capable of making her own choices. The man's blessing was conditional and somewhat cold, but it was genuine, accompanied by a warning that Michael had better prove worthy of the trust being placed in him. As they left the office together, the young woman took Michael's hand with a firmness that suggested the last barrier between them had fallen, that they were now free to build whatever future they could create together. The engagement happened 6 months later, not with grand gestures or expensive rings, but with a quiet proposal on the beach, where they had taken Emma to hunt for shells and build sandcastles. Michael asked the question while their daughter played at the water's edge, making it clear that he was proposing not just to the woman he loved, but to the idea of becoming a family together. 3 people choosing to bind their lives in mutual commitment and care. The ring was simple but carefully chosen, reflecting her practical nature and his modest resources, but it represented something precious beyond its material value, a promise of partnership and shared responsibility. Emma's excitement when they told her was infectious, her immediate assumption that this meant more people to love her and for her to love, an innocent understanding that captured the essence of what they were creating together. The wedding was small and meaningful, held in the community center where they had worked together on projects that mattered to them both, officiated by the nonprofit director who had become a friend to them all. Emma served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her role in the ceremony reflecting her importance in the new family they were forming. The guest list included the neighbors who had supported Michael during his hardest times, colleagues from his work, volunteers from their shared projects, people who had chosen to be part of their lives rather than those connected by obligation or social expectation. The developer attended with his wife, sitting quietly in the back, his presence a reminder of how their story had begun, but not defining how it would continue. As they exchanged vows, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance encounter on a rainy night to a love that had grown through shared values and mutual respect. The woman who had once stumbled in the rain had become his partner in building a life that honored both their pasts while embracing their shared future. Emma stood beside them, beaming with the joy of a child who understood that her family was growing rather than changing, that love multiplied rather than divided when it was given freely. The future stretched before them with possibilities they were only beginning to imagine, a family bound not by obligation, but by choice, not by circumstance, but by commitment to caring for each other through whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. As they drove away from the reception, Emma chattering excitedly about the dancing and cake, Michael and his new wife exchanged a look that carried all the love and gratitude they felt for the unexpected path that had led them here. The story that had begun with a simple act of kindness had become something beautiful and lasting, proof that ordinary people